Most people in the middle class don't feel poor, but they also don't feel free. And that uncomfortable in-between state is exactly what makes the middle class financial trap so hard to recognize and even harder to escape. Because on the surface, everything looks stable and respectable. There is a regular income, bills are paid on time, life appears responsible. Yet beneath that appearance, there is a constant low-grade pressure, a quiet anxiety that never fully disappears. A feeling that progress is fragile and that one unexpected expense, one job disruption, one medical issue, or one economic shock could destabilize everything. And let me ask you something honestly. If the middle class is doing everything it was told to do correctly, why does it still feel like running endlessly without getting closer to freedom? Why does effort feel constant, but relief feel temporary? The answer is not laziness, lack of discipline, or bad character. The answer is structural and psychological, because the middle class is built around a promise that slowly breaks down over time. The promise that steady income, responsibility, and consistency will naturally lead to security, comfort, and upward mobility. But what many people discover instead is that stability without leverage turns into confinement. Income without margin becomes obligation, and responsibility without flexibility becomes a cage. And this is where the feeling of being trapped begins. Not because life is failing, but because life is functioning exactly as designed for a system that rewards reliability rather than freedom. Think about how middle-class life is structured. Income is mostly tied to time, expenses are mostly fixed, and expectations keep rising quietly year after year. Housing costs, car payments, insurance, education expenses, subscriptions, lifestyle upgrades that initially feel like rewards but slowly transform into necessities. Each decision makes sense on its own. Each commitment feels reasonable and mature. But together, they create a system that demands consistency above all else. And once consistency becomes mandatory, risk starts to feel dangerous. Experimentation feels irresponsible, and slowing down feels impossible, because too many things depend on everything continuing to work without interruption. And this is why so many middle-class people feel anxious even during good years, because their life is balanced on predictability. There is very little margin for error, very little room to pause and reassess, and almost no space to change direction without consequences. Psychologically, this creates a constant background stress, a sense of being needed by the system rather than supported by it. The system requires you to keep showing up every month, every year without disruption, and as long as you do, you are rewarded with stability, but not with freedom. And this is the first layer of the middle class trap. Stability slowly shifts from being a choice to being a requirement. And when stability is no longer optional, freedom quietly fades, not through dramatic collapse, but through accumulation of obligations that feel responsible, decisions that feel sensible, and commitments that feel unavoidable. And what makes this especially difficult is that none of this feels like failure. There is no obvious mistake to point to, no single bad decision to undo, which is why the middle class often blames itself, thinking it should be more grateful, more disciplined, more content, even as the pressure continues to build. Because from the outside, the middle class looks successful, safe, and respectable, but from the inside, it often feels tight, fragile, and exhausting, like living inside a system that demands constant performance in exchange for temporary comfort. And until this tension is clearly named and understood, most people will continue trying to solve the problem with harder work, better budgeting, or more income, without realizing that the trap is not a lack of effort, but the structure of a life where stability was mistaken for freedom. The second layer of the middle-class trap quietly forms through fixed costs and lifestyle inflation, two forces that feel responsible on the surface but become restrictive over time, because the middle class is socially and culturally encouraged to convert every increase in income into permanence rather than flexibility. And at first, this feels like progress, a better home because it's safer and more comfortable, a newer car because it's reliable, better insurance, better schools, better neighborhoods, better conveniences that reduce friction in daily life, each upgrade framed as maturity and good judgment. And let me ask you something honestly. When was the last time an increase in income truly reduced your stress instead of simply reshaping it into a new form? Because for most people, higher income doesn't create breathing room. It creates new commitments, and commitments are sticky. Once they exist, they don't easily disappear. Fixed costs do not care about how motivated you feel, how hard you work, or how circumstances change. Mortgages do not pause when income slows. Car payments do not shrink during uncertainty. Insurance premiums, utilities, subscriptions, education expenses, and everyday living standards remain rigid even when life becomes unpredictable. And this rigidity is what creates the feeling of being one crisis away from collapse, not because the middle class is reckless, but because margin has been quietly traded away for comfort and predictability. And psychologically, this creates a constant background tension, a sense that income must be protected at all costs, because too many things depend on it working perfectly, which is why risk begins to feel irresponsible and change begins to feel dangerous. Even when change might be the only path to long-term freedom, lifestyle inflation deepens this trap because it rarely feels like indulgence. It feels like normalization. Yesterday's upgrade becomes today's baseline, and once something becomes baseline, losing it feels like failure rather than adjustment. So people work harder not to move forward, but to defend what they already have. And this defensive posture slowly drains energy, creativity, and courage, because the goal is no longer growth, it is maintenance. And maintenance is exhausting when it requires constant output with no pause. This is why middle-class stress often increases alongside income, because higher income raises the cost of stability instead of lowering it. Every raise increases the level of income required just to feel normal. And over time, this creates a painful paradox. People appear successful from the outside, but feel increasingly constrained on the inside, earning more while feeling less flexible, upgrading life while shrinking options. And what makes this especially dangerous is that the process is invisible. There is no single moment where someone chooses to become trapped. It happens gradually through reasonable decisions that accumulate, each one slightly reducing optionality, until optionality quietly disappears. And without optionality, freedom becomes abstract, something talked about but never touched. This is why middle-class people often feel confused by their own dissatisfaction. They did what they were told, made sensible choices, avoided obvious mistakes, yet still feel pressure instead of peace, because the structure of their life cannot bend when life inevitably changes. And a system that cannot bend eventually feels brittle. This brittleness fuels anxiety, overwork, and a constant fear of disruption. And until people recognize that the real problem is not spending itself, but the rigidity of commitments, they will keep trying to solve a structural issue with surface-level behavior changes, cutting small expenses, optimizing budgets, chasing raises, without realizing that the deepest pressure comes from a life designed around fixed obligations rather than adaptive capacity. And this is where the middle-class trap reveals itself most clearly, not as financial irresponsibility, but as a life built for consistency instead of resilience, where stability was purchased at the cost of flexibility, and flexibility is the true foundation of freedom. The third layer of the middle-class trap is built around time for money thinking, a model so normalized that most people never question it, even as it quietly limits their ability to build momentum or leverage, because the middle class is taught that the primary way to improve life is to trade more time, more effort, and more responsibility for higher income. And at first this works: work harder, get promoted, earn more, upgrade life, repeat. But let me ask you something honestly. If trading time for money was enough to create freedom, why does life often feel more constrained the more successful someone becomes? The answer lies in how income is structured, because when income is tightly coupled to time, presence, and performance, it becomes fragile. Any interruption threatens the entire system. And this is why middle-class people often feel chained to their schedule, their role, and their availability. They are not just working for money, they are maintaining a system that depends on them showing up continuously, and this creates a subtle but powerful form of dependence, where freedom is postponed in exchange for stability. And over time, postponed freedom begins to feel unreachable. Time for money thinking also limits leverage, because leverage comes from systems that can produce value without requiring proportional increases in personal effort. But the middle class is rarely encouraged to build systems. They are encouraged to become more skilled, more reliable, more indispensable. And while those traits are valuable, They also deepen dependency, because the more indispensable you become, the harder it is to step away, and the more your identity becomes tied to your role, the harder it is to imagine life outside of it. This is why many middle-class professionals feel trapped by their own competence. They are good at what they do, respected, relied upon, and compensated accordingly. Yet every increase in responsibility tightens the bond between time and income, making flexibility feel like a luxury they cannot afford. And psychologically, this creates a narrowing of options. People stop asking what they want long-term and start asking what they can safely maintain. And once safety becomes the primary filter for decisions, leverage disappears, because leverage requires patience, uncertainty, and delayed reward. All things that feel dangerous when your entire life depends on consistent income. This is why middle-class people often work harder during periods of stress rather than rethinking structure, because working harder feels safer than changing the system, even when the system itself is the problem. And this creates a cycle where effort increases, but momentum does not. People exhaust themselves maintaining a level instead of building upward movement, and exhaustion further reduces the capacity to think creatively or take calculated risks. Reinforcing the trap, another hidden cost of time for money thinking is that it teaches people to equate effort with value. So when income doesn't rise proportionally with effort, frustration grows, resentment builds, and people begin to feel undervalued, not realizing that the issue is not recognition, but structure. Because no matter how hard you work, time is finite, and any model based primarily on time will eventually hit a ceiling. And when that ceiling is reached, progress slows while pressure remains, which is why so many middle-class people feel stuck at a certain level, not falling apart, but not moving forward either. And this is where the emotional weight of the trap intensifies, because stagnation feels personal even when it is structural. People blame themselves for not pushing harder, learning faster, or sacrificing more, when in reality the system they are in cannot produce freedom no matter how well they perform inside it. And until this realization happens, most middle-class people will continue optimizing effort instead of redesigning structure, trading more time for marginal gains, while wondering why freedom always feels just out of reach. Because the trap is not that they are working too little. It is that they are working within a model that converts effort into maintenance instead of leverage. And maintenance can keep life stable, but it cannot move it forward. The fourth layer of the middle-class trap lives in debt psychology and social expectations, a combination that quietly amplifies pressure even when income appears healthy, because the middle class is taught to use debt not as an emergency tool, but as a normal extension of identity and belonging. And this begins early. Student loans framed as investment in self, credit cards framed as convenience, mortgages framed as adulthood, car loans framed as reliability, and each form of debt justified as responsible and necessary. Yet, let me ask you something honestly. How free can anyone feel when so much of their future income is already spoken for? Because debt is not just a financial obligation, it is a psychological contract with the future. It assumes that tomorrow will look enough like today to sustain the promises made yesterday. And this assumption creates pressure. Pressure to remain employable, pressure to avoid disruption, pressure to keep income stable, even when life demands change. And the deeper someone moves into middle-class life, the more these invisible contracts accumulate. And socially, this pressure is reinforced because debt is normalized and even encouraged as a marker of progress. Buying instead of renting, upgrading instead of waiting, financing instead of saving, all framed as signs that you are moving forward. And once these expectations are internalized, opting out feels like failure rather than strategy. People feel ashamed of slowing down, downsizing, or choosing simplicity, because the middle-class script equates progress with expansion, and expansion almost always requires borrowing. This creates a powerful emotional bind. Because even when debt is manageable on paper, it consumes mental bandwidth, it turns income into obligation before choice, and it shrinks the psychological space needed for creativity, risk-taking, and long-term thinking. Many middle-class people carry this weight silently. They don't talk about it because from the outside, everything looks fine. They are not struggling in obvious ways, so they assume their anxiety is personal rather than structural. But the truth is that debt amplifies fragility. It makes life less forgiving. Because when something goes wrong, there is no pause button, payments continue, expectations remain, and the margin for error disappears. And this is why the middle class often feels constantly on, always needing to perform, to maintain appearances, to meet obligations. Because falling behind doesn't just mean financial inconvenience, it feels like social failure. Another hidden layer of this trap is comparison, because middle class life is lived publicly. Neighbors, coworkers, friends, social media all create a continuous feedback loop that reinforces what normal should look like, what success should feel like, and how quickly progress should happen. And even when people intellectually understand that comparison is harmful, emotionally they still feel its pull because belonging matters, and belonging often comes with expectations. Expectations to live at a certain level, to provide certain experiences, to maintain certain standards. And these expectations push people to borrow not just money, but peace of mind, trading future flexibility for present conformity. And over time, this creates exhaustion, not from overspending, but from constantly managing a life that has very little slack, where every decision must account for obligations already locked in. And this is why the middle class trap feels so heavy, even when income is decent, because debt and social pressure combine to turn stability into fragility, progress into pressure, and success into something that must be defended rather than enjoyed. And until people recognize that the emotional cost of debt and expectation is as real as the financial cost, they will keep trying to solve the problem by earning more instead of questioning the assumptions that created the pressure in the first place. Not realizing that true freedom is not about eliminating all debt overnight, but about restoring psychological breathing room, the ability to make decisions without fear of social judgment or financial collapse. And that breathing room is the one thing the middle class is rarely taught to prioritize, even though it is the foundation of any life that truly feels free. The fifth layer of the middle class trap comes from being over-optimized for safety while being under-optimized for resilience. And this distinction is subtle but powerful, because safety and resilience are often confused, even though they produce very different lives. Safety is about preventing disruption, while resilience is about being able to absorb disruption without collapsing. And the middle class is trained almost entirely around safety, stable jobs, predictable income, fixed schedules, long-term commitments, detailed plans, insurance for every category, and backup plans for backup plans. And on the surface, this looks wise, responsible, and mature, but let me ask you something honestly. What happens when life does not follow the plan? Because life never fully does. Industries change, skills lose value, health fluctuates, family responsibilities shift, economic cycles turn, and opportunities appear unexpectedly. And in those moments, a life optimized only for safety often struggles the most, because safety depends on conditions remaining stable, while resilience assumes instability and prepares for it. The middle class model quietly assumes continuity, that income will continue at roughly the same level, that roles will remain relevant, that energy and health will stay consistent, that external systems will keep working as expected. And when those assumptions are challenged, anxiety spikes sharply, not necessarily because the problem is catastrophic, but because the structure underneath the life is rigid rather than flexible. And rigidity turns even small shocks into major threats. Psychologically, this creates a constant need to control outcomes, to plan excessively, to avoid uncertainty, because uncertainty feels dangerous when there is little slack. And over time, this conditions people to see change itself as a threat, not as a neutral or even creative force, which is why many middle-class people feel uneasy even when presented with positive opportunities, a new role, a new direction, a chance to pivot, because change threatens the carefully balanced system they depend on, even if that system is quietly draining them. This is where safety slowly becomes stagnation, because resilience requires exposure to uncertainty, learning through discomfort, and building multiple ways to recover. But the middle class is rarely encouraged to build recovery capacity. They are encouraged to build protection, and protection feels comforting until it becomes confining. because the more energy goes into preventing things from going wrong, the less energy remains for creating options if they do. And this imbalance slowly erodes vitality, creativity, and confidence. Another hidden cost of over-optimizing for safety is identity fragility. When someone's sense of self-worth is tightly tied to being responsible, dependable, and stable, any disruption feels like a personal failure rather than a normal part of life. A job loss feels like a moral flaw, a pause feels like weakness, a change in direction feels like regression, and this amplifies shame and self-blame even when circumstances are clearly external. Resilient systems expect failure and recover quickly, but safety-based systems deny the possibility of failure and therefore panic when it occurs. And this is why the middle class often experiences burnout rather than breakdown, exhaustion rather than collapse. They keep holding things together through sheer effort, telling themselves they just need to push a little longer, plan a little better, work a little harder until holding becomes unsustainable. And because nothing visibly breaks all at once, they assume the problem must be internal, that they lack discipline, motivation, or gratitude, when in reality, the issue is structural, a life designed to avoid disruption rather than adapt to it. And adapting requires slack, optionality, and psychological flexibility, all of which are slowly sacrificed in the pursuit of perfect stability. And until this difference is clearly understood, people will keep doubling down on safety strategies, more insurance, more planning, more control, more work, without realizing that what they actually need is resilience, the ability to absorb change without panic, to adjust without collapse, and to recover without shame. Because true freedom does not come from a life where nothing ever goes wrong. It comes from a life that can withstand things going wrong without falling apart. And this is one of the quiet tragedies of the middle-class trap. It produces lives that look safe on paper, but fragile in practice, because they were built to prevent waves, not to survive storms. The sixth layer of the middle-class trap forms through comfort culture and the gradual loss of optionality. And this is one of the most deceptive layers, because it rarely feels like a problem while it is happening. Comfort feels earned, deserved, even healthy after years of effort and responsibility. And the middle class is encouraged to optimize life around reducing friction, more convenience, more predictability, more ease, food delivered instead of cooked, services instead of skills, subscriptions instead of ownership, routines instead of experimentation. And none of this is wrong on its own. But let me ask you something honestly. What happens when life becomes so optimized for comfort that even small discomfort feels intolerable? Because optionality is built through tolerating inconvenience, uncertainty, and temporary discomfort. And comfort slowly erodes that tolerance. The middle class often trades flexibility for ease without realizing the long-term cost, choosing the path that feels smooth today, even if it narrows tomorrow's choices, locking into neighborhoods, schools, schedules, and obligations that make daily life comfortable, but long-term change extremely difficult. And over time, this creates a life that runs efficiently but cannot easily pivot. Psychologically, comfort becomes a ceiling rather than a foundation, because once a certain level of convenience becomes normal, anything below it feels like regression. And this creates fear around change, even positive change. People start evaluating opportunities not by their long-term upside, but by how much discomfort they introduce in the short term. And this bias quietly shapes decisions, turning down paths that require uncertainty, learning, or temporary instability, even when those paths could lead to greater freedom later. This is how optionality disappears, not through dramatic mistakes, but through repeated small choices that prioritize ease over adaptability. And the most dangerous part is that comfort disguises itself as stability. People believe they're protecting themselves when they are actually narrowing their future. And this narrowing often goes unnoticed until circumstances force change, and suddenly the lack of options becomes painfully visible. Another hidden effect of comfort culture is dependence. When life is optimized around services and systems, people slowly lose confidence in their ability to adapt, solve problems, or tolerate hardship. They outsource friction until friction feels threatening, and this creates a subtle fragility. Not financial collapse, but psychological fragility, the feeling that any disruption would be overwhelming. And this fear reinforces the desire to maintain the status quo at all costs, even when the status quo is draining. This is why many middle-class people feel stuck even when life is comfortable, because comfort without optionality becomes confinement, routines harden into ruts, conveniences turn into dependencies, and freedom quietly shrinks. And socially, this is reinforced by narratives that equate success with ease. The idea that if you are doing well, life should feel smooth, effortless, and predictable. But real freedom is rarely smooth. It requires phases of discomfort, periods of uncertainty, and stretches where progress feels awkward rather than elegant. And when those phases are avoided, freedom is delayed indefinitely. The middle class is rarely taught to value optionality directly. The ability to change direction, reduce costs quickly, pause without panic, or experiment without collapse. Because optionality does not look impressive on the surface, it often looks inefficient, unoptimized, even irresponsible. Yet it is the single most important ingredient for escaping the feeling of being trapped. Because optionality turns life into a series of choices rather than obligations. And without it, even high income and comfort feel fragile. The tragedy is that comfort is often pursued as a reward for responsibility, when in reality, comfort should be a byproduct of resilience, not a substitute for it. And until people recognize that ease is not the same as freedom, they will keep trading away optionality in exchange for short-term comfort. Only to wake up years later feeling safe but constrained, successful but stuck, realizing that the life they carefully optimized now requires constant maintenance, but offers very little room to move. And this is the quiet moment where many middle-class people first sense the full weight of the trap, not as financial failure, but as the realization that comfort has slowly replaced choice, and choice is the true measure of freedom. The seventh layer of the middle-class trap is fear of risk, not because risk is inherently bad, but because the middle class is taught to avoid it rather than learn how to manage it. And this difference quietly shapes an entire life, because avoiding risk feels responsible while managing risk feels uncertain. And responsibility is rewarded far more than adaptability in middle-class culture. From an early age, people are taught to choose certainty over possibility, stable paths over uncertain ones, predictable outcomes over asymmetric upside. And let me ask you something honestly. How many of your major life decisions were guided more by fear of loss than by belief in long-term gain? Because fear becomes the dominant filter when there is little margin for error. And the middle class by design has very little margin. Fixed costs are high, obligations are constant, expectations are rigid. And when margin is thin, even small risks feel existential, which is why many middle-class people are not risk-averse by personality. They are risk-averse by necessity. They cannot afford failure because failure would ripple through too many obligations. So they learn to stay within narrow lanes, to perfect execution instead of exploring direction. And over time, this conditions the mind to associate risk with irresponsibility rather than growth. But here's the quiet problem. Wealth and freedom do not come from eliminating risk. They come from taking better structured risk that is limited, intentional, and asymmetric, where the downside is survivable, but the upside is meaningful. And this kind of risk requires margin, patience, and psychological tolerance for uncertainty, all things the middle class is slowly stripped of as life becomes more optimized and fixed. So instead of learning how to manage risk, people learn how to avoid it. And avoidance compounds. The longer someone avoids uncertainty, the more threatening it feels, the less capable they believe themselves to be, and the more fragile their confidence becomes, even when their competence is high. This is why many middle-class professionals feel simultaneously skilled and stuck, confident in execution but afraid of change, good at solving problems inside a system but uncomfortable questioning the system itself. And psychologically, this creates a narrowing of imagination. People stop asking, what else could I build, and start asking, what must I protect? And once protection becomes the dominant goal, growth slows dramatically, because growth requires exposure, experimentation, and the willingness to look foolish, fail quietly, or move sideways before moving forward, all things that feel deeply uncomfortable when identity is tied to being competent and responsible. Another hidden cost of risk avoidance is regret, not immediate regret, but long-term, quiet regret, the kind that shows up years later as the feeling of unrealized potential, of having played it safe for so long that the idea of change feels impossible. And this regret is especially painful because it is not attached to a single mistake, but to a series of safe decisions that made sense individually but closed doors collectively and socially. This is reinforced by narratives that glorify security while quietly shaming experimentation. People who try and fail are seen as reckless, while people who stay within bounds are praised as sensible, even if they are deeply unhappy. And this teaches the middle class to prioritize approval over agency, to avoid embarrassment rather than pursue alignment. And over time, this erodes courage, not dramatic courage, but everyday courage. The courage to try something small and uncertain, to learn publicly, to change direction without permission. And until people relearn how to engage with risk in a measured, intentional way, they remain trapped, not by lack of opportunity, but by fear shaped by a system that made risk feel dangerous instead of teachable. And the tragedy is that risk avoided does not disappear. It accumulates in another form: the risk of stagnation, the risk of regret, the risk of living a life that is stable but chosen. And this risk is rarely discussed, even though it is often the most costly one of all. When you're ready, say next, and I'll continue with Chapter 8, 6,000 characters, where we explore why the middle class confuses income with wealth and how that misunderstanding locks people into endless effort without ownership. The eighth layer of the middle class trap comes from confusing income with wealth, a misunderstanding so widespread that it quietly shapes nearly every financial decision people make, because income feels tangible and reassuring, while wealth feels abstract and distant. And let me ask you something honestly. If income alone created freedom, why do so many people earning good money still feel financially tense, overworked, and dependent on their next paycheck? The reason is that income is a flow, while wealth is a stock. Income requires constant participation, while wealth can exist independently of daily effort. Yet the middle class is trained almost entirely to optimize income: higher salary, bonuses, promotions, billable hours, side hustles, overtime. And while all of this increases earning power, it does very little to reduce dependency, because when income stops, the system stops. And psychologically, this creates a treadmill effect. People run faster to stay in place, mistaking movement for progress. And this confusion is reinforced socially, because income is visible and easy to compare: titles, salaries, lifestyles, while wealth is often invisible, quiet, and boring. And since the middle class lives in a world of visibility and comparison, income becomes the scorecard. People feel successful when income rises and anxious when it plateaus, even if their underlying security has not changed. And this is where endless effort begins, because income has no finish line. There is always another level to reach, another standard to maintain, another expectation to meet. And without wealth-building mechanisms, effort simply sustains lifestyle rather than building independence. Ownership is the missing piece here. Wealth comes from owning things that produce value over time: assets, equity, systems, skills that scale. Yet ownership requires delayed gratification, uncertainty, and patience, all of which feel uncomfortable in a life structured around immediate income needs. So the middle class often postpones ownership in favor of income optimization, telling themselves they will invest later, build later, take risk later once things feel more secure, not realizing that the structure of their life prevents that feeling from ever arriving. And psychologically, this creates a loop of postponement, where the future is always promised but never reached. Another hidden consequence of income obsession is burnout, because income depends on continued performance, and performance requires energy, attention, and presence. And when people build their entire sense of security around income, rest feels risky, slowing down feels irresponsible, and boundaries feel dangerous, which is why many middle-class people feel guilty for resting even when exhausted, because rest does not produce income directly, and this guilt slowly erodes health, creativity, and perspective, further reinforcing dependency. And socially, this is normalized. People praise hard work without asking what it is building toward, and might celebrate busyness as virtue and equate constant effort with ambition, even when that effort produces very little long-term leverage. And over time, this shapes identity. People begin to see themselves primarily as earners rather than owners, performers rather than builders. And once identity locks in this way, behavior follows. Decisions favor short-term income over long-term equity, safety over upside, certainty over compounding. And this is why the middle class often feels trapped despite working harder and earning more, because effort is being converted into maintenance rather than independence. And until this distinction becomes clear, people will keep chasing income milestones, believing they are moving closer to freedom, when in reality they are simply reinforcing a system that requires them to keep running. Because income pays the bills, but wealth buys time, choice, and peace. And confusing the two keeps people endlessly busy while quietly delaying the very freedom they are working so hard to achieve. The ninth layer of the middle-class trap is short-term optimization, a mindset so normalized that it feels practical rather than limiting, because the middle class is trained to focus on immediate efficiency instead of long-term direction. And this training begins early. Do well this year, hit this target, secure this role, manage this expense, solve this month. And while none of these are wrong on their own, together they condition people to think in short horizons. And let me ask you something honestly. When was the last time you made a decision based primarily on where you want to be 10 or 20 years from now, rather than what feels safest or smartest this year? Because short-term optimization feels responsible, it reduces friction today, but it quietly steals leverage from tomorrow. The middle class is rewarded for predictability, reliability, and quarterly performance, not for patient positioning. And over time, this shapes behavior. People optimize resumes rather than trajectories, cash flow rather than compounding, comfort rather than optionality. And psychologically, this creates tunnel vision. Life becomes a series of problems to manage rather than a direction to build, which is why so many middle-class people feel busy but not fulfilled, productive but not progressing. They are constantly improving efficiency inside a system whose destination they never consciously chose. Short-term thinking also amplifies fear, because when attention is fixed on immediate outcomes, any disruption feels catastrophic. A bad quarter feels like failure, a slow year feels like falling behind, and this emotional intensity pushes people to overcorrect, to chase quick wins, to abandon long-term strategies the moment they feel uncomfortable, even when those strategies are sound. This is why investing, skill building, and ownership are so often interrupted, not because people lack intelligence, but because short-term feedback overwhelms long-term intention. And socially, this is reinforced by environments that celebrate fast results, promotions, raises, visible wins, while quietly ignoring slow compounding, patience, and invisible progress. People learn to value what can be measured now rather than what will matter later. And this bias shapes everything, from career moves to spending habits to lifestyle choices. People choose paths that pay quickly rather than paths that scale slowly, because the pressure to show progress is constant. And this creates a paradox. The more someone optimizes for short-term security, the harder it becomes to invest in long-term freedom. Because long-term thinking often requires short-term sacrifice, ambiguity, and faith. Things that feel irresponsible in a culture obsessed with immediate validation. Another hidden cost of short-term optimization is regret delayed. Not the sharp regret of a bad decision, but the dull regret of realizing years later that you optimized yourself into a corner, that you became very good at maintaining a life that no longer excites you, that you climbed efficiently, but toward a destination you never consciously selected. And this realization is especially painful because it arrives quietly, often in moments of pause, burnout, or transition, when the question, "What is all this for?" finally surfaces. And at that point, change feels harder because the system is well optimized, commitments are tight, identity is established, and optionality is thin. And this is why the middle class often stays stuck, not because it lacks opportunity, but because it optimized away the slack required to change direction. Efficiency replaced exploration, certainty replaced curiosity, and stability replaced intentional growth. And until people relearn how to think in longer arcs, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, they will keep solving for comfort today while quietly postponing freedom indefinitely, because wealth, flexibility, and fulfillment are not built through perfect short-term decisions. They are built through imperfect long-term alignment. the willingness to accept temporary inefficiency in exchange for future autonomy. And without this shift in thinking, the middle class trap remains intact, not as a dramatic failure, but as a life that runs smoothly while slowly drifting away from what it could have been. The 10th layer of the middle class trap comes from chasing external success while losing internal alignment, a disconnect that quietly drains meaning even as life looks successful on the outside, because the middle class is taught to measure progress through visible markers, titles, income, credentials, lifestyle signals, milestones that can be explained and approved by others. And let me ask you something honestly. How often do you make decisions based on what looks like progress rather than what actually feels right over the long term? Because external success provides validation, but validation is not the same as direction. And when validation becomes the compass, people drift. They choose paths that make sense on paper, even when those paths quietly pull them away from their values, energy, and curiosity. And this drift is subtle. It doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like responsibility, like maturity, like doing what is expected. And over time, expectations harden into obligations. Obligations harden into identity. And identity hardens into a life that feels increasingly misaligned. And psychologically, this creates a quiet exhaustion, not the exhaustion of overwork alone, but the deeper exhaustion of living a life that requires constant self-justification, telling yourself that what you're doing makes sense, that it will be worth it later, that everyone feels this way. And this inner negotiation consumes energy because misalignment requires effort to maintain. People perform competence while suppressing doubt, ambition while ignoring boredom, success while postponing fulfillment. And socially, this is reinforced by praise, promotions, and recognition that reward outward performance, making it even harder to question direction, because questioning feels ungrateful or risky when things appear to be going well. This is why many middle-class people feel guilty for wanting change. They believe dissatisfaction means they are failing to appreciate what they have, not realizing that discomfort is often a signal of misalignment rather than ingratitude. Another hidden cost of external success chasing is narrowing identity. When people define themselves primarily by role, status, or income level, stepping away from that definition feels like losing oneself, which makes change emotionally threatening, even when change is necessary. And this fear keeps people locked into paths that no longer fit, because the cost of redefining identity feels higher than the cost of staying misaligned. And over time, this trade-off erodes vitality, creativity, and presence. People become efficient but disengaged, accomplished but restless, stable but unsatisfied. And because everything looks fine externally, they assume the problem must be internal, that they need more gratitude, more discipline, more motivation, when in reality, the issue is that external success has crowded out internal truth. And this crowding deepens the feeling of being trapped, because freedom is not just financial, it is psychological. The freedom to choose work that fits, to say no without guilt, to evolve without permission and without alignment. Even financial stability feels hollow, because money amplifies the life you are living. It does not correct its direction. And this is why some people reach what they thought was success only to feel more stuck than before, because they invested years optimizing a life they never truly chose. And the longer that investment, the harder it feels to change. But alignment is not about abandoning responsibility. It is about integrating responsibility with intention, asking not just, does this pay or does this look good, but does this move me toward a life I want to live? And until the middle class is taught to value alignment as much as achievement, people will keep climbing ladders that lean against walls they would not choose if they pause long enough to ask. And this is one of the deepest traps of all. A life that looks successful, functions smoothly, and earns approval, yet quietly pulls the person living it further away from themselves. The 11th layer of the middle class trap is the inability to slow down and reflect. Not because people don't want clarity, but because constant motion has become a survival strategy, and slowing down feels risky when life is built on continuous output. The middle class is conditioned to stay busy, productive, responsive, always moving to keep the system running. And let me ask you something honestly. When was the last time you had enough quiet space to think deeply about your life without immediately needing to act, justify, or optimize. Because reflection requires stillness, and stillness feels unsafe when income, obligations, and identity depend on momentum. So people keep moving, not necessarily because they are progressing, but because stopping feels dangerous, and this constant motion masks deeper dissatisfaction. Busyness becomes a shield against uncomfortable questions about direction, meaning, alignment, and long-term desire. And psychologically, this creates a loop. Movement reduces anxiety in the short term, but prevents insight in the long term. Because insight often arrives only when noise settles, and when noise never settles, clarity never fully forms. This is why many middle-class people feel vaguely dissatisfied but cannot articulate why. They sense something is off but cannot name it, because naming it would require space. And space feels indulgent or irresponsible in a life optimized for productivity. Another hidden cost of constant motion is reactive decision-making. When life is always in motion, decisions are made under pressure, responding to the next email, the next bill, the next deadline, the next expectation, and reactive decisions prioritize immediacy over intention, solving problems instead of shaping direction. And over time, this turns life into a sequence of responses rather than a deliberate path. People become very good at handling what comes next, but very disconnected from where it is all leading. And socially, this is reinforced by cultures that praise hustle, responsiveness, and availability, while quietly discouraging pause, reflection, and reassessment. People who slow down are often seen as unmotivated or complacent, even when slowing down is exactly what would allow better decisions to emerge. And this social pressure keeps people moving long after movement has stopped serving them. Another subtle consequence is emotional numbness. Constant activity dulls awareness. People stop feeling deeply dissatisfied because they are too occupied to feel at all. Exhaustion replaces curiosity, routine replaces imagination, and life becomes manageable but muted. And this numbness makes change even harder, because change requires feeling the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And if that feeling is suppressed by busyness, the motivation to change never fully crystallizes. This is why many people only reassess their lives during forced pauses, illness, layoffs, burnout, major disruptions, moments when motion is interrupted and suddenly clarity floods in. Not because the situation is better, but because there is finally space to see. And this reveals a painful truth, that much of the middle-class trap is maintained not by lack of opportunity, but by lack of reflection. People are so busy maintaining their lives that they never step back to ask whether the life they are maintaining is still the one they want. And this maintenance becomes self-perpetuating, because the longer someone stays busy, the more responsibilities accumulate, and the harder it feels to pause, creating a loop where motion prevents reflection and lack of reflection justifies continued motion. And until this loop is broken, meaningful change remains elusive, not because people are incapable, but because they never give themselves the conditions required for insight. And freedom without insight is impossible, because without understanding what truly matters, effort will always be misdirected. Energy will always be scattered, and life will continue to feel full yet strangely unfulfilling. And this is why slowing down is not laziness, it is a prerequisite for escape. Because only in stillness can people see the invisible structures shaping their lives, question assumptions they've never questioned, and begin to imagine alternatives that are not immediately obvious from inside the motion. And without that pause, the middle-class trap continues quietly, efficiently, and indefinitely, powered not by failure, but by uninterrupted momentum. The final layer of the middle-class trap is also the beginning of its exit. And it starts not with dramatic change, but with a quiet shift in how life is designed. Because escaping the feeling of being trapped does not require burning everything down, quitting jobs overnight, or rejecting responsibility. It requires reclaiming optionality, resilience, and direction, one layer at a time. And let me ask you something honestly. What would change if your life did not need to run perfectly in order to feel secure? Because the core issue the middle class faces is not effort, intelligence, or ambition. It is fragility disguised as stability. A life that looks solid but depends on too many things going right at once. And the way out begins by slowly increasing flexibility instead of chasing more intensity. This means building slack before chasing scale, reducing rigidity before adding responsibility, and creating space before demanding progress. Optionality grows when fixed costs are reduced, when commitments are questioned instead of assumed, when identity loosens its grip on roles and status, and when decisions are evaluated not just by how they feel today, but by how reversible they are tomorrow. Resilience grows when people allow small amounts of discomfort intentionally, learning to tolerate uncertainty in controlled ways, experimenting without betting everything, developing multiple skills, income streams, or paths that don't all depend on the same system working perfectly, and direction returns when reflection is prioritized over reaction, when time is protected not just for productivity, but for thinking, reassessing, and asking deeper questions about what kind of life is actually being built. Because freedom is rarely found by doing more. It is found by designing better. And this design process is gradual, often invisible and deeply personal. It looks like choosing flexibility over status, margin over maximum consumption, alignment over approval, and patience over urgency. And these choices may not look impressive from the outside, but they quietly change how life feels on the inside. Anxiety softens, pressure eases, decisions slow down, and confidence becomes grounded rather than performative. And over time, the treadmill feeling fades, not because income suddenly explodes, but because life no longer depends on constant motion to feel safe. And this is the real redefinition of success the middle class is rarely offered. Success not as constant optimization, but as the ability to pause without panic, to change direction without collapse, and to live with intention rather than obligation. And if there's one thing to take away from this entire exploration, it is this. The middle class feels trapped not because it lacks opportunity, but because it was taught to prioritize stability over flexibility, comfort over optionality, and approval over alignment. And the moment those priorities begin to shift, even slightly, the trap starts to loosen, quietly, steadily, without drama. And that is where real freedom begins, not as an escape, but as a reorientation. And if these ideas resonated with you, if they helped you see your relationship with money, work, and life a little more clearly, then this is exactly what the Mindful Brief exists for. Calm, thoughtful conversations that help you step back from noise, question assumptions, and think more intentionally about how you're living. So if you want to continue exploring money, psychology, work, and life at a deeper level, take a moment to subscribe to the Mindful Brief, because the goal here is not to rush you toward answers, but to help you ask better questions. And those questions asked consistently over time have a way of quietly changing everything.